So, Tim Gray, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
First, and I'm going to put this like as simply as possible. I know you know, but for our listeners and people watching on YouTube, what is happening in Wasaga Beach right now that has gotten you and other environmentalists, let's say in a tizzy? What's got you in a tizzy?
Yeah, well, tizzy's maybe the right word for it. The provincial government is proposing to sell about 60% of the Wasaga Beach Provincial Park beachlands. So these are dunes, shoreline, heavily used public areas, but also have very high ecological values. We have endangered species there. We have Atlantic coastal plain flora. Um, and of course, provincial parks are meant to be protected for the people of Ontario forever. They have a mandate to maintain ecological integrity. They have professional staff who are biologists and ecologists and know how to look after these lands. So the proposal is to sell them for a development project that the town of Wasaga Beach wants to go forward with. And so it's both the fact that these particular lands, which is in a park that is either the first or second most visited park in Ontario, depending on the year. So it's both the specifics of this, but it's also the whole principle of selling off provincial parkland, which we all collectively own,
Hmm.
for particular development interests. So it's really, really concerning. And of course, the other part of this proposal is to actually amend the Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Act in some kind of unspecified way, which the province so far hasn't disclosed. But given that they could actually remove these lands using the existing legislation, we're concerned that their plan is to actually make it more possible to remove parklands in the future without having to do what they have to do now, which is do a report to the legislature and have a vote of individual members of provincial parliament. So we're worried they're going to take it into being a secret process done by cabinet or by a minister, and the public will not even know that it's happening. So it's kind of a two-pronged concern, I would say.
Right. There's a process by which if you want to, I hate the word dispose of lands because it sounds like we're getting rid of them. But if you want to dispose of provincially owned lands, there's a process that, especially if it's a provincial park too, and maybe there's a distinction there that between just something like I know there's property here in Guelph that is owned by the government of Ontario that's not necessarily a park.
Mhm.
Although some people would like it to be a park, I'll put that aside. Um, but for a provincial park especially, there is a set process, and what is that process right now?
Yeah, currently the Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Act, which, as you say, is specific to these provincial parks or conservation reserves, has a section in it which requires the government to do a report, to produce a report, research a report, present that to the legislature, and then have a vote on the proposed changes or the sale of that land by all of the MPPs. So clearly they could do that in the case of Wasaga, where they're planning to sell off a large area. But instead, they're saying, oh, well, we're going to amend the act. We're not going to tell you what the wording is, but trust us that we're going to amend the act to make this possible. And the minister has said a couple of times that they're only amending the act to allow this land removal, but that makes no sense because they don't need to amend the act to actually allow this to go ahead. So it makes us very concerned they're planning broader changes to make land removal from provincial parks more broadly easier and without a vote of the legislature, which means it could be done in secret at a cabinet meeting or even just by the minister if that's the way they change it. So that would threaten, all of our provincial parks, including places where we can imagine the development industry would love to get a hold of them. Think of like big hotels in the middle of Algonquin or in Killarney.
And
You can imagine lots of folks would like to get a hold of that land and build private developments. So having the act change with no disclosure of what the planned changes are is really concerning.
it strikes me that, and I'm doing some reading on this. The mayor of Wasaga Beach, Brian Smith, he's for this redevelopment project. It's probably easy to imagine there are probably a lot of business interests in Wasaga Beach who are eager for a redevelopment project. There was that big fire, I think it was in 2007, that They're still feeling the effects of almost 20 years later. You know, COVID-19 had massive impact on tourism. There's probably justification that would be probably pretty easy to make in a formal process to be brought forward in the legislature. Um, and I imagine, and I'm not sure the answer to this off the top of my head, the MPP for the Wasaga Beach area is probably in the PC caucus in the government bench. You're shaking
Yes.
your head, yes. Um, I mean, this should be easy, right? Like, is it just because they don't trust the I mean, this is getting into the head of the government a little bit. I mean, do they just not trust the legislative process, or as you're kind of implying, this is genuine skullduggery? This is like another test case for like how can we use provincial authority instead of legislative authority?
Yeah, I'm not sure what their actual plan is. And for sure, Wasaga should be able to go ahead with tourism development. The question is, should they be able to go ahead with building condos or hotels on a beach that is ecologically significant in a provincial park and has endangered species on it? Now the town insists that they have no plans to do that, that they just want to have this land. Well, if you're planning on protecting it, and it's in a park now, and you have an agency who has a legal mandate to do so, resources, staff, ecologists, enforcement mechanisms to ensure that it's not damaged, why would you want to take it over if you have no development interests in these lands? And if you do have development interests in these lands, then you shouldn't because they shouldn't be developed. The town has already transferred lands to a major developer in the area of its own. There's lots of private lands, which you've noted, many of which, you could say from a business perspective are not being used to their highest use. All of those are private. Those could be purchased by a developer, could be expropriated by the town. These are well back from the beach. These would leave the ecologically important areas, which are also used by the public to access the water and go swimming, um, out of the development proposal. There, this does not have to be some kind of zero-sum game where either you develop all these ecologically significant parklands or you don't have any development. The premier likes to characterize any effort to protect the environment as being necessarily opposed to economic development. But we've had a long history in this province over the last 40 or 50 years of realizing that you need to do these two things in tandem.
Right.
And the idea that you can't do them both is kind of a throwback to, like, I don't know, 1930s or something. Like, there are real consequences for not considering the ecological impacts and environmental impacts of development proposals. And the idea of putting condos or marinas in the middle of what is currently a provincial park makes very, very little sense. And I think most people in Ontario will oppose it.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and I think it's like one of those things like on the list of if your brain's only able to manage 10 issues a day, this falls down to 11, 12, especially if you don't live in the Wasaga Beach area. Um, I was thinking about this in this way, this issue. Um, as you mentioned, having a provincial park requires certain levels of expertise in terms of ecological management, at-risk species, arborists, that kind of thing that may not be necessarily available at the municipal level. And I think under a different situation, I might look at this as a case of downloading. They don't want to manage this ecologically sensitive land that might, cost an extra couple of bucks as opposed to an average forest to maintain. But we also have the backing of the municipality wanting to take possession of this property, likely for some kind of redevelopment. Um, is that just not a consideration then, the ecological sensitivities? Because I can't imagine the town of Wasaga Beach as a corporation has the resources to deal with these dunes that you're speaking of, these beach dunes and these endangered species. No one at that city hall is probably going to be taking possession of that file if they take possession of these lands.
No, I mean, most municipalities do not have the resources nor the legal mandate that Ontario Parks does. And they're not going to prioritize the survival of endangered species like piping plover, for example, which is a very rare shoreline bird which nests right on the beach. Whereas the parks folks have to. That's their legal mandate to ensure these species survive. We've as an organization been involved with issues of beach management, not in just Wasaga, but also over on Sable Beach,
Mm.
where the municipality was quite hostile to the management of that beach, so that those species could survive, because their idea of what a beach should look like is you drive a bulldozer down it every once in a while and keep it nice and level and clean, for human use, right? Instead of thinking about, well, how do humans co-use this space that an endangered species absolutely relies on for survival? And our concern is we'll run into both development threats, a marina or condos on this land, and or an approach to looking after this beach, which conflicts with having these species survive.
I'm thinking about like those TikTok reels of, people who put like bacon, dig a hole and put bacon bits in the hole and all these like worms come out of the beach and it's always there's animals you don't necessarily see enjoying the beach as well. Um this is part of this as well. The I went back and read the press release from, I think it was February, and it said we're going to keep the beaches open to the public. And I meant there's a devil advocates piece of this. It's like, I don't know what you're so worried about all this redevelopment for. We said we're going to keep the beaches public. Is there a real chance that we're going to? I mean, as we talk about on the show sometimes, the friends of Doug Ford who are always looking for new business opportunities. I mean, is that assurance worth anything in a press release? We're going to keep the beaches open
Well,
to the
nothing
public.
in a press release is worth much. I think, especially from the current government around any kind of environmental protection or protection of public interest. I mean, they repeatedly said they were never going to touch the green belt, and then the first thing they did after getting reelected was, or getting elected the first time, was go out. The first time back down because of public backlash, and then after the next election they tried again. So it's not worth a lot, they've demonstrated, but. I think, one of the issues here would be is that if the beaches in fact do become the home of big hotel complexes or condos, is there'll be a continuous pressure, and that'll be applied to government to have the beaches in front of these things become private, because it would
Right,
add to their asset value. If you own a very expensive condo on the shore of Georgian Bay, I'm sure you'd like to have it private for you and your friends, and that'll be a constant pressure.
right,
So I, don't give much credence to the idea that you can build a huge private development on these lands and then have them continue to be open to the public. We've seen lands that used to be public closed to the public before, when big private developments occur adjacent to them.
right. I want to get out my crazy string here because, hearing about what's happening in Wasaga Beach, I'm drawing connections to what's happening up the road from us here in Guelph and Wilmot. The appropriation of farmland, we still don't know for who or who's leading it, whether it's the Waterloo region or whether it's provincial government, it's somebody else. I'm thinking about MZOs, which is like, the planning process moves too slow, so we're just gonna, use this tool in a way that's never been used before. Thinking about Bill 5. Um, I guess there are two ways I want to look at this. Number one is these are all kind of a piece, right? This is all kind of a similar strategy of we're going to move too fast that you can't really protest against it because, I mean, I think there's a point of view that all NIMBYism is bad NIMBYism. But there's also a thing here where it's like we want to remove public input from planning processes because I think there's the impression that that's where all the money is going or where all the money is being lost with these development is having to follow environmental assessments and planning council committee meetings and all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the province in Bill 5, of course, has eliminated the Endangered Species Act. They canceled environmental assessments for some existing dump and an existing mine. They're also, through their special economic zones, proposing that for particular areas of any size with no criteria, that all provincial and municipal laws could be suspended for any folks or any companies or any friends of the government that they so designate. So, this again digs into this assumption or assertion that the government makes that any provincial law, any environmental rule, any labor law is somehow an intolerable interference with business. Well, I guess we'll see. I mean, how that plays out. We'll see whether the people of Ontario are really up for the idea that there are no laws anymore in Ontario, and that anyone who's a friend of the government can proceed with the development exempt from any laws that they so specify. We'll also see whether that survives a constitutional challenge because having cabinet take over responsibilities of the legislature, may not pass much of a legal smell test when it gets to court. We'll see. But we have laws for a reason. They're not just done for, creating red tape. We've lost 85% of the wetlands in southern Ontario. We used to build on floodplains. People died during Hurricane Hazel because we allowed houses to be built on floodplains. We used to dump DDT into the environment and it wiped out almost all the major bird species that feed off fish in Ontario. Like there are real consequences for going back to the bad old days. And but maybe it's been too long. It's been 40 years since we passed major environmental legislation throughout North America, including by many right-wing governments. That maybe people have forgotten what it was like when we just dumped all of our crap into the water, into the lakes, and when we didn't have any planning and we didn't consider other values. Like maybe we're going to get a chance to see and see the consequences. I'm not sure.
That's interesting how you frame that because I feel like we are seeing consequences. I mean, I kind of laugh, but I kind of don't when I see Republican Congress people from Michigan like writing sternly worded letters about air pollution from Canadian wildfires. And it's like, well, you're the people who don't believe climate change is real. So it's, I
Absolutely.
mean, maybe the answer is the person looking back you in the mirror. But I mean, we do feel that, and we've seen that like air quality advisories. We've seen that number go up in the last 2 years because of wildfire smoke. We have Doug Ford proposing full speed ahead with the 401 tunnel, even though surface streets get flooded if we get like 100 millimeters of rain in 2 hours. I feel like there's cause to be concerned about the environmental damage of how our society is set up, but that message doesn't seem to, or it gets through and then it's quickly in one ear and out the other, as it were. Um, I don't know what the question or what the answer is, but I mean, we're seeing the damage right now, and it just doesn't seem to change it. We don't need to go back to days of lakes on fire. We have our own environmental disasters we're seeing.
Yeah, and climate change is posing existential threat to our civilization. I mean, we're seeing it manifest, like you say, even for people that are far, far away from it in the form of smoke from wildfires. We see increased flooding events, all these things, of course, and they're only going to get worse. Um, the I think politically, one of the challenges is that all of these things they come in stochastic events, right? Like you have a
Mm,
flood event, or it's smoky for 3 or 4 days, and then also you've got like the political cycle, right? With increasingly severe and threatening and scary situations occurring in the political world, right? Donald Trump,
right.
rise of fascism in the US, decay of democracy in the US, direct threats to Canadian sovereignty and the trade risks and people's jobs and all those kind of things. So there's these great kind of insecurities that come directly to people's ability to like bring home food the next day. And then in the midst of that, like you have like our last provincial election, for example, you have a premier who says, vote for me. I'm going to protect you from Doug Ford or protect you from Donald Trump. I guess that was a Freudian slip.
It's
So
one I make
yeah,
all the time myself. It's perfectly all
so yeah, he's going to protect you. He's
right.
promising to protect us all from Donald Trump. But of course, the first thing that he does after the election is introduce a bill that's so draconian in its sweeping removal of legal authority and legal rules around development and business that it would make a Republican congressman salivate.
Yeah,
Like it's so it's very disingenuous. There's nothing in the campaign platform saying, "Oh, by the way, if you vote for me, I'm going to get rid of the Endangered Species Act, get rid of the environmental assessment on a mega dump, cancel it for a mine in Northern Ontario, and give free ride to any business proposal that's put forward by somebody who's a friend of government, and you won't have to follow any laws." Like that wasn't in their platform. In fact, they didn't have a platform. But the public, I think, feels very, very nervous and stressed. And I think when it's kind of human nature in a way, I think to kind of stick with what you know when you feel
right.
threatened. And I think that's a big driver of that. And I don't think we should read too much into the public suddenly not caring about climate change or, wanting the wetland or the forest in their backyard to be filled in or destroyed. I think they were actually voting for the proposition that was put in front of them that they were going to be protected.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry, but you got fooled. You're not being protected. You're being exploited, and your rights and the things that keep you safe are being eroded.
I mean, that's one of the kind of big ironies of all of this is that essentially, I mean, Doug Ford isn't saying it in these words, but he's essentially like, I have to exploit you before Donald Trump does.
Well, yeah, in some ways, that's what it feels like. I mean, and there are no criteria around who these special companies are going to be. So, is it going to
Right.
exclude American companies? Is it going to prioritize American companies? Like, who knows? Because there are no rules.
I think that's the concerning thing about all this, and I think that um, it's speaking of in terms of like activism, in terms of what people can do. The government isn't following the rules, but us members of the public still have to follow the rules. We can't just like barge into the legislature and pass our own bills. I mean, it'd be interesting if we did, but in terms of, the work going on in environmental defense right now, in terms of ways people can get active and get involved, and not necessarily just on Wasaga, although I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to this who have enjoyed the beaches at Wasaga and want to make sure they remain public. But in terms of how people can organize as we're going into fall and, maybe there's more time for political stuff in people's lives, what are some of the things environmental defense is working on?
Yeah, we really try and prioritize working with folks, where they're at. We really encourage people to pick something in their community that they care about. And if it has an environmental element to it, then, we're a good place to come to around help to do that, right? We can help people figure out like what they need to organize around. Each community group we find has different sets of skills depending on who's involved, right? Like what are the skills they already have? Quite often people have a lot more skills, connection, knowledge, influence in their community than they realize. And we can help them identify what those things are and then maybe fill some of the gaps or help them with training or whatever it is to help move an issue forward. But our experience is that a relatively small number of people that decide to make some change in their community are quite often successful. And yeah, you've probably seen this, like especially at a municipal level, if it's a decision that say is within the authority of a municipality, they hear so seldom from the public
Right.
uh, that you get a half a dozen people that have decided that okay, we're not going to have that wetland filled in that you've decided that you're going to allow a developer to fill in. Well, we've just decided that's not happening because it's a value to our community, and I've seen it time and time again. Like we just work with a community group and Scugog Island First Nation over on Lake Scugog, where there was a development proposal there under the new wetland rules, which is basically a massive rollback in protection. They're going to build this big development. It was going to be impacting a wetland right on the lake, and people in the town and First Nation were just like, "No, we don't think so." And we organized with them and brought some of our skills to bear, and ultimately we got the town to not support it. So it is doable. It is possible. And, for bigger issues, province-wide issues, linking up these community groups across the province, linking them with their members of provincial parliament makes a huge difference. And ultimately, that's what caused the province to back down with the Greenbelt, right? Their
Right.
MPPs were just overwhelmed. There was over 120 protests in front of MPPs' offices over an 8-month period. And of course, it all then turned into investigations and all kinds of other things. Some of it's still ongoing
Some is,
because
yeah.
people were so outraged by it. And you know, there's no choice in a democracy. You either use the tools that you have or you don't. And if you don't, somebody else will,
That's
and
right.
they'll get what they want and you won't.
That seems like a good place to leave it on. So I will just say most councils, I think, take August off. Or at least Guelph City Council will be back in business next week. So yeah, stay involved. And Tim Gray, thank you so much for your insights today, and appreciate it. Thanks for joining
Thanks so much
us.
for having me. Have a great rest of your summer.